Hello everyone and welcome to our sessions on digital heritage inspection and survey, which are kindly funded by Historic England. This is a programme of 10 sessions for learners of different experiences and backgrounds to find out more about how digital models and digital twins are being used in the heritage sector. There's a WhatsApp group where the learners can co-mentor and share resources too. My name is Linda Jubb and I'm your host today. I'm a Chartered Building Surveyor and Fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Our practice, Jubb Clues, specialises in the survey and repair of historic buildings. So our session today is about who's making and using models, and I'm delighted to introduce my co-presenter, Tom Martin. Tom's a Chartered Structural Engineer and he's also conservation accredited with the CARE scheme. Tom joined Man Williams in 2014 after a stint at Alistair Burrows Design Partnership. His undergraduate degree was in architectural engineering at Cardiff University, and he's still based in Cardiff now. He's worked on all sorts of projects. Scheduled monuments and ruins are a speciality, and that's the case study that we'll be bringing forward today. And I'm particularly delighted that Tom's with us. Would you like to say a few words, Tom?
So I work for an engineering consultancy now called Man Williams, and we do an awful lot of work in heritage buildings, both in sort of pure conservation of standing ruins down to sort of refurbishment projects, and do manage to fit in a few more normal engineering projects in there as well.
Okay, so you've got work in the mainstream as well as in heritage sector.
Yeah, some, but it does tend to be more at the sort of small architect, nice houses type end of things, which is an interesting, different challenge.
Yes, I'm not sure how much mainstream building surveying I'm doing these days.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It can be when you spend all your time looking at crumbly bits of masonry, trying to do proper calculations on normal things that have a sort of standard way of doing it is not as comfortable.
Yes. So I'm going to come back to you, if I may, in a minute, Tom, and I'm just going to set up with a bit more background information about this session. So we're going to try and have a handful of learning objectives today. We want to try and understand the benefits of using different types of models and data sets. We're trying to think about what kind of people might benefit from using our models, and also understand some of the outcomes of doing our work this way in a sort of digitized way. And also think a bit more about not necessarily our professional communities or our project communities, think about the wider audiences and communities as well that will be using our models. I think when we talk about the audiences who come straight to mind about using digital models, I obviously think of the clients and building users first. They're very often the people who are commissioning the models, and we've got quite a few clients and building owners here today. So I hope you'll tell us a bit more about your experiences. But they are a communication tool, and I'll come back to this point later about bringing more people into the heritage and sharing our buildings, our assets with them. We've used digital models extensively with contractors, and doing simple things like dropping a QR code onto a paper drawing that's on site means that contractors can pull up the models on their mobile phones. It helps them when they're dealing with their subcontractors. You know, there's only so many times contractors can visit site while they're putting their prices together, and when they need to talk to their own teams. Obviously, we use them with colleagues, practitioners who are working in different disciplines, especially when we're putting together things like statements of significance, cost plans, these additional pieces of information that the clients want us to do. We use them with students and members of the public. There are people in this learning group who are using them for an entire portfolio and for property management. And of course, then using BIM models in facilities management is increasingly adopted, not so much in the heritage sector. And this is this overlap with us working in the mainstream as well. And we've used them extensively in heritage-led delivery teams, particularly heritage action zones and heritage at risk, which I think I'll deal with in a bit more detail next week. So in terms of outcomes from using these models, we think there are some tangible benefits and outcomes. One of them is that we think we can reduce the number of site visits, or at some level reduce emissions. We can get access to obscured and dangerous areas not visible from ground level. And the image there on the right is me tiptoeing around the case study, Hampton Gay. One of the outcomes of digital models, I mean, really famous example, is an accurate record of the building if there's a terrible loss. And the example that springs to mind is Notre Dame. As we covered last week with Kira, you're building a flexible data set that you can update. You can either run that in real time with sensors, or you can update it at set points during your project. And again, Tom will tell you in the case study that we've got that was something that we were doing at Hampton Gay. We can improve the engagement with the public, being able to bring people to these assets, especially when they're on private land or they're difficult to get to, is a key benefit. And we also have enabled participation by people who would encounter other challenges, such as physical challenges coming to the site. So I did a little thumbnail exercise. Is like how much money do we think we've saved in terms of not going to site as often because we've got our digital models? And this is just a bit of thumbnail working. So this is like QS type work, isn't it? Let's say we have 5 projects a year using these models, and each project saves on 3 site meetings for 3 people. 60 pence a mile is the rate I've put on there, and that's just £8,000 of savings just in travelling. So probably not enough to pay for the model, but a significant saving. And that's only with a very small example. The more you use them, the more you save. I also applied the same sort of criteria to think about how much we could save in terms of carbon, CO2 emissions, and for the same exemplar, using statistics from Carbon Independent and making generalities about this, I reckoned about 320 kilos of CO2 emissions over 5 projects in a year. Obviously, that's only one side of the argument. And Tom and I, when we were doing our prep for this session, started to think about the other side of the coin. And thank you to Richard for running the figures for me on this one. There's a lot of carbon dioxide use in storing data. So I think one of the statistics we got there was that there's about 0.2 tons of CO2 per year for storing 100 gig of data. These data centers do require cooling and so on. So using the case study here, I think the images were 21 gig, and we used them over about 18 months. So that comes out as roughly 0.6 tons of CO2. And for 5 projects, if they're all the same size, that would be 3 tons of CO2, which I was slightly surprised by that calculation because it looks like 10 times the savings in travel. And I need you all to go away and think about this, because I don't know whether my figures are right. There are lots of other things that we're doing, though, that are controlling emissions. So we talked last week about decimation and only storing what data we need. So I think the decimation on this, when the actual cloud component of what you were storing, Tom, went down to a fraction. They went into Sketchfab. So a bit of a sacrifice in terms of the overall quantity of data, and therefore slight impact on quality, but absolutely worth it. And for your cybersecurity, obviously less is more in terms of the amount of data that you're storing. A lot of cloud service providers are now using renewable energy. I think Microsoft gave an undertaking that by this year they were going to have them entirely running sustainably. I don't know whether that's still on the agenda. Things seem to have changed very recently, away from big tech being part of a green future. And obviously only store data as long as is necessary. That's a key way of reducing your emissions. Oh, sorry, and one of the things I should say about the example with the travel to site is that obviously we're now increasingly using electric vehicles, so some of those figures are going to be off on that side as well. So I think there's lots of opportunities there for us to reduce emissions, whichever way we do it. But I think there's a role for us to play here with our digital twin project. One of the main benefits of these digital models is the way that we collect the data does give you improved access to the site. And if you think about that earlier picture of me standing well back from a rather overgrown monument, using these remote sensors such as terrestrial laser scanners or drone-based photogrammetric models will keep you at a safe distance away from the structure. With an increased degree of accuracy. The other thing about the accuracy is, that for preservation, and this is the example of Notre Dame, is you do need that level of accuracy. We haven't been able to achieve it before, so that's extremely useful. We think a little bit more about client side. Who is coming to your building? Can you offer your services in an equal way to everybody? And I don't want to dwell on the intricacies of the Equalities Act, but it's all about what is a reasonable adjustment. I think these kind of virtual reality models can help you with making reasonable adjustments where some of the best parts of your building are maybe not accessible, not particularly accessible, and yet you want to be able to share them. And a really good example is, church towers. I mean, I think there's probably only the bell ringers and the surveyors who go up the church towers these days, but they have really interesting components of the historic building up there that we really like to share with people, so that's worth having. And of course, we're used to seeing all sorts of other experiences on our phones, so why would the historic environment not be included there? There's a lot of guidance around, some of it from Heritage Lottery and some of it from RICS and other providers. We'll give you the links to all of these, but how to use digital media in your social media and marketing. When you want to reach out to people, these are amazing tools to help you to do that. One of the things that came up in my conversation with Tom when we were preparing our case study for you was how much these digital models contribute to improved learning outcomes. And for people who aren't at the moment working in the heritage sector, I think it might be worth sharing with you at this point some of the published guidance around conservation principles policy. For England, published now through Historic England, there's this document, which again I will make accessible to you, which sets out 6 conservation principles. They're very much people-based rather than place-based. We start from a principle of the historic environment as a shared resource. So the more people to whom we can give access to the historic environment, and the more people who understand it, the better it will be cared for. That was the underlying principle. Principle 2 is that everyone should be able to participate in sustaining the historic environment. So this isn't just a technical undertaking. This is a social undertaking that has meaning for everybody. And that's what we mean about improved learning outcomes. Whether you're a kid in school who's just starting to get excited about Romans, or whether you're a sort of Civil War reenactment type person, all of these historic places have got relevance to you, and they've got learning opportunities that people can embrace, not just people who are working with historic environments or particularly interested in them. Understanding the significance of place is vital, and significance is a word that's bandied around in the heritage sector, but significance is really the same thing as importance. there is almost a hierarchy within the heritage sector of what's important to who. The significant places principal force should be managed to sustain their values, and there's a lot of that in this case study, having to make hard choices about what you can and can't do. Decisions that we as professionals make about change must be reasonable, transparent and consistent. It doesn't do any good for the historic environment sector for us to just make irrational decisions or decisions that we're not prepared to justify. And documenting and learning from our decisions is essential. And again, that's where our work here with digital media is so relevant. So when suggested the improvement in learning outcomes, Tom, what did you specifically have in mind?
So the main thing I had in mind was on a professional basis. So going back to some of what you were saying about site visits and the cost of them, we're often as consultants in a position where there are a handful of people in a consultancy that have the expertise and the skills to undertake site visits like the one done at Hampton Gate. But there are often other people involved in those organisations who, if they have access to a digital model, can be involved in the project, can learn from the project, and through that process gain the skills where they can be the people doing visits like that in the future. And I think that's a really important thing, and it's something we certainly struggle with as a consultancy, is making that jump of investing enough in people to take them to site visits to gain the experience they need to be useful on those site visits. It's certainly something we've been trying to do more of, is those internal reviews. Now that me and one of the other engineers are both CARE accredited, the opportunity to do a review of each other's projects is really useful. And things like digital models enable you to sort of spin around and point at and look at specific bits of things that would otherwise be really challenging.
Absolutely. Yeah, love it. So shall we share our case study? This is about the ruins of Hampton Gate Manor. I'm going to do a little limbering up about the significance of the site. So significance is sometimes measured through designations. And in this case, I mean, where we always go to for a quick view of the designations is there's a search facility on the Historic England website, search the list. So you can find out whether something's listed, whether it's a scheduled ancient monument. What it won't tell you is where the conservation areas are, because at the moment that lives in a different GIS system. But again, through this project, we're thinking about what kinds of different data can we bring together. It also is on the Heritage at Risk Register, which is published on the Historic England website, or it was at the time we started the project. And one of the really nice outcomes of the project and the investment that was made there is it has now been removed from the Heritage at Risk Register. As I say, my experience of it was that it was in a hell of a state. And even being able to make decisions about how we were going to care for it was extremely difficult, because it was difficult to see it. And even in the time where we were carrying out our initial research and analysis, storm after storm took away entire elements of the building. In the early records, we had photographs of one of the chimneys there, and then later it was gone. This chimney here at the back was still there right up to the time when we approached it with the cherry picker and started trying to make safe access for ourselves. But sadly, that couldn't be retained, and that was one of the difficult decisions that we had to make. I'm going to hand over to Tom now, because actually a lot more of this is about the model, because this is how we found our way in.
Yeah. So essentially, this was modelled using photogrammetric system, which uses sort of digital photography to build a three-dimensional model. And we ended up doing this over three phases of the project. So this model on the right-hand side is the sort of middle phase. The first phase was done before large amounts of vegetation clearance were done. this phase was sort of the ready to do work phase.
So
And then
this is
there was-
before we put the scaffolding up, isn't it? Because there is, and I know that some of the people who are in the session today will know that obviously we can't, it's a scheduled monument, so we can't just go and start taking loose bits off it without scheduled monument consent. So as you say, the original model, sorry, I will go back up a slide, looked a lot like this. There was not a lot to see, but it was recorded and it gave us access to have those communications to start the consent process. At this point, before the scaffolding went up and before the repairs started, as you can see, this chimney here has fallen down, but we tried to recreate using the model, this view that you can see in the etching, because one of the great benefits of using the models is to be able to create the artist eye view of it, which you don't necessarily get from a camera because of the twisting effect of the lens, and be able to compare what we're working on with historic views of the building. So the record that we took, this is the intermediate record, is the stage 2 record then, Tom.
Yeah, and then as you say, so the image on the left is then the etching, historic etching of what the building looked like originally, and we've lined the model up to match that view. And then on the next slide, this then is the final record of the building, following all of the work that was done and all of the conservation that was done. And it is quite an important feature of heritage projects, is being able to demonstrate at the end of them what has actually been done, and particularly it's something we found that recently more heritage bodies are asking for completion reports at the end of projects, so that they have a sort of capping off of the project to say that you had consent to do this, this, and this, but what of that actually got undertaken and how did all of that change on site? Because there is always a degree of change in these sorts of works.
And some of it controversial. I mean, one of the things that we did at Hampton Gay, and the reason that I've chosen this slide, and just want you to compare it again with the slide before, is that you'll see that this chimney here that fell down during the analysis period was reinstated, and you can see it there in the etching, but you can see we had enough components from it to do it properly. And in the consent process for historic environments, there's really heavy reliance on not so much published policy for buildings in use, but even more foundational documents. And what I've put on this slide here is an extract from the Venice Charter, which is one of the ICOMOS underlying principal documents, which talks about the circumstances in which you would do restoration. So restoration and conservation are different undertakings. Conservation might be taking the back because it's unstable, to make sure that you don't have an uncontrolled collapse of the entire back of the building, to make it more to stabilize it. And we also put some Syntec anchors and all the things in there to make that a more enduring part of the monument. But restoration is a very subjective assessment and subject to strict rules. And the reason that we chose to do it in this case was because we wanted to try and maintain more of the skyline. I'm just moving my cursor over, I hope you can see that. So that when you experience this building in the landscape, you have still some idea about its scale and so on, because reading buildings from plan form only, when the ruin is down to sort of knee high, and I know a lot, we do look after a lot of that kind of it's almost archaeology at that point.
Yes.
We do look after that, but I think being able to conserve this and some of the experience of it is significant. And that was a really in-depth conversation we had during the course of the work, and the model really helped us with that as well, because as you say, at the closing out of the project, we did put another set of digital documentation there on the record.
It's also very key when you're looking at restoration as opposed to conservation, is the degree of evidence that is available. And I mean, even just the etching that is here provides a huge amount of evidence for what that chimney looked like, how tall it was and how it was detailed. And that making sure that restoration is an accurate restoration rather than conjecture and guesswork is always a very important feature of it.
Yes, we were so lucky when we sifted through the rubble that we did find enough of these components with the mouldings and everything on them that the masons were able to piece it together. And that was, again, it was an opportunity that was only very narrowly available to us. Now, this one's over to you, Tom, because you're going to tell me all about this.
So this is then looking at some of the process of how the modeling functions and what it uses. So the image on the left there is just a snapshot of thumbnails of the various images that went into this model. It used 800 photos in the end, taken from 2 different cameras, so both from terrestrial DSLR camera and from drone footage, which that's saying was 5.5 gig of data that was going into the model, and that's for one of the 3 of them. The software also does utilize some of the EXIF data in the images. So as Linda alluded to, camera photos are always distorted, and the software uses a distortion model to correct for lens distortion. And so having that EXIF data is useful to the software in knowing what the angle of the lens was that was used. And then the image on the right is getting into some of the processing that the software is doing. And the first step that the software makes is to compare each of the images and find features that it can find in other images. So the green lines between the 2 images are showing where it has found features that it thinks are the same in each of those 2 images. And these 2 images are roughly at 90 degrees to each other. So there's quite a difference in where those features are. But it's also quite a helpful image because there are only 10 or 15 features, so you can actually see it. Typically, where you would have 2 photos taken side by side to help build a good quality model, you would have hundreds or thousands of similar features between the 2 images. And then this sort of comparison becomes very, very difficult to read and understand. So then if you pop onto the next slide.
Thanks, Tom. I noticed that's the part over the porch, and we had to take that right down to the string. So there was also a level of comfort for us. Obviously we do the usual thing about numbering the stones very carefully, salvaging everything, but of knowing that we had very, very good digital record before we had to do
that. So then once the software has found all of these features that it can link the images between, it then does an extraordinary quantity of trigonometrical maths functions to essentially work out the relative position of all of those features based on the angles and positions of them in different images, and therefore align them all in 3D space and align each of the images in 3D space. So each of the sort of colored dots on that represents one of the features from those images that's in enough images for it to be positioned in 3D space. And each of the sort of white triangular pyramid shape images on there is one of the photos from the survey. So you can see a sort of spread of images at ground level, which is all of the terrestrial photography. And you can see the changing shape of the sort of pyramid shape in them is indicating the zoom level or the of those images. And then you can see a sort of cloud of images above the building, which are taken with the drone, which, due to the way that drones work, is usually all a fixed focal length rather than changing. And then the next slide. This then is another one of the sort of model checking tools that is available within the software. And this is showing the degree of interconnectivity between those images. So I believe the blue is the least number of connections up to the yellowy red color, which is the most number of connections. So we can see a couple of sort of useful and interesting things, that some of the further away images, like the collection of sort of 5 images at the top, are well connected to images further down, but haven't managed to connect to each other for some reason, which just suggests that there isn't a level of sort of shared overlap between those images. The other thing that jumps out of this model as a weakness is the area over to the right where Linda's cursor is, where there is very limited connectivity between sort of 3 big groups of images. And when you actually look at the site, there's a massive tree in the way in that corner, which makes it very obvious why the hasn't managed to get that level of connection around that corner. And that gives us useful things where we can then interrogate the model in more detail around that corner to make sure that we're getting expected results, things are looking like they should. Or if it was an extreme situation, those are where we could then go back and try and infill gaps in the data to improve the quality of the model.
I found this such an interesting part of the prep when we did this, because you can just see that dust here and that dust there. That is where the trees are, and where the terrestrial and the low-level drone images were just not available. When you were saying to me, you know, that these triangles, these viewpoints here, are not connected one to the other because we're further away, but these ones here, they are. You know, you can see that this is a tighter part of the model. The other thing I'm going to just flick back into the other slide for is to put in here a note about measurement, because actually getting close enough to the monument to get the measures, we could have done it by EDM, but
yeah,
it's just one key measure on this. And this is maybe the difference between practitioners like you and me, Tom, putting models together, and proper geospatial surveyors,
yes,
like Kira, whom we heard from last week, who will tell you that this is just not possible to do it properly without a proper measured traverse.
and there are ways that this potentially could have been done more properly using photogrammetry, but essentially we used, so the control points you can see there, the blue points, are manually added into the model. So by picking points in photographs, and once you have picked the same point in 3 photographs, it will appear in the model. But by adding it into more and more photographs, you get better and better accuracy. And then the distance between those was, in this instance, it was taken from Google Earth as a scaling dimension. And then there are 2 other scaling dimensions, which are further away from the building, but that did appear in all of the models. Now, there are other options for things like this. You could have used a tape or a laser and put stakes in the ground at 10 meters apart that weren't necessarily close to the building, so that you had the access to measure them, but then made sure that those were then included in the model. And that would probably improve the accuracy, because essentially the photogrammetric system is dimensionless. So the model that it produces, it has no idea whether it's taken on a massive format camera and is a really big scale thing, or whether it's taken on a tiny cameras and it's a tiny scale thing. But what is accurate is the relative dimensions between everything.
I was going to do a Father Ted example, but that's maybe for the older part of the audience. It depends on the accuracy you need for the project. So it's worth saying at this stage, not only did we know that this building was very difficult to get to, and we were investing very heavily in the research phase, it also was clear to us that having very detailed quantities for the work wasn't necessarily going to improve the quality of the work that we did. We needed to know a certain amount of quantification to make sure that we bid for the right amount of money and we didn't run out of money in the project. That would have been a bad thing. But in terms of actually designing things and making decisions based on dimensions, that wasn't something that we were going to have to do. So
and that's the level of accuracy that essentially your guesstimation of how much masonry needs to be treated in a certain way is so much less accurate than the model is that actually the accuracy of the model isn't super important at that point.
And we've
And
got, yeah, we've got QSE type ways that we can deal with that as well, you know, with provisional quantities and the way that we run the contract. The remeasurement that we did when we were hands-on is where we started introducing the accuracy and the control over that. So the order in which you get control over the detail for projects like this, to some extent, depends on how good your access is and how much you're willing to invest at this stage in your geospatial model. And the thing about this case study is that this was so available to us, you know, and it, within the overall constraints of the project, that why wouldn't you, you know? There's another slide here, Tom, that I think that's got important detail for us as well.
yeah, so this is one of the sort of checking and analysis features in the software. So by selecting individual images in the model, so the left-hand image, you can just see the photograph that's selected as the green highlighted pyramid. The right-hand image is actually off the page, and then showing which of the points in the model are from those images. So the yellow highlighted points in the model are showing the points that are from the two images. And what you can see is that whilst there is some overlap visually between the two images, there's particularly some of the sort of left-hand side wall is in both images, one face of the chimney is in both images. Actually, because those are at quite tight angles and the resolution in those areas of overlap is not great, and there aren't many shared points in that point selection between the two images. So it's just sort of showing how much overlap is needed between these images to get the modeling to work, but it's also showing how you can interrogate the model to check for issues and problems with the model. And you can also run this process the other way. So you can select a selection of points and then say which images do those points appear in, which is sometimes a useful feature and sometimes an incredibly frustrating feature.
I must admit, at this point, I'm starting to wonder, you know, what is the value of this? And has that been your experience, Tom, that making a model and being reasonably light around the way you do it has been accessible to you, but behind it, you're sort of drawn to this all sorts of other things going on that you could.
I mean, there's so many odd sideline benefits of models like this. And actually, one of the things that I use when I'm working on projects like this is the model in this form, just as a photo record. So that when you're saying, I can't find that handful of photos that I took at the top of the chimney, you have a 3D model showing where all the images are, and you can zoom into the top of the chimney and find the images that are taken there. And actually, that can be more effective than trying to label photos accurately or scrolling through hundreds of photos to find the relevant photos of the bits that you're trying to look at. So yeah, there are quite a few sort of sideline benefits to some of this. The other thing,
I think that is the learning by doing element of this, isn't it? So, for instance, this view of the chimney here, we knew the chimney had fallen down. Actually, for the first 3 months of this project, we didn't have any scaffolding on the front range here because of the ecological constraints. We were waiting for the maternity season to end so we can move from the rear range to the front. Meanwhile, I'm trying to hold budget between phases here, knowing that we have to come and do this. So you're right. You know, having something like this that we can come along and interrogate, that's not a view you can get from ground level.
yeah,
And short of poring over all of the photographs to find a key view like that while we're trying to make decisions and we're in our stand down for maternity rooster season, is a great way to use the model.
and the other thing is the thing about having that dimensionality and things that you can check and measure. So in that left-hand image, there's a Nila stone there that looks somewhat vulnerable. Getting an estimation for how big that stone is, how much it weighs, and therefore getting a QS to give you an idea of what the cost is it would be involved in picking it up and lifting it to ground. Without a 3D model, you would need a cherry picker or a scaffold to get up close to it to be able to actually take those dimensions. And at the sort of crudest level of photogrammetry, the most basic way I've used it in the past is having done opening up works in a building where we've lifted floorboards that happened to not find the steel beam that I was looking for, but being able to see it and taking a handful, like 10 images in a floor void with enough of a scaling dimension that you could then build a model and work out what size the steel beam is from that. And actually that at those sort of two levels, the sort of proper model that we've got here and that really rough and ready model, and both of those, it can be incredibly useful as a tool to help with investigation and survey.
Yes, I was thinking about making our poll today, whether or not people thought that you ought to always use a geospatial surveyor, or whether actually they were willing to have a go themselves. But when I had a quick chat with John Bedford, who's joining us at 2, and he is obviously at the deep end of geospatial, we did say that there's a huge spectrum in between finding your happy place on that spectrum, finding the right thing for your client and your project on that spectrum, and knowing that it exists is maybe a better learning outcome for this course as a whole.
I think that's the thing with models like this, is remembering what the model is based on, remembering what the limitations of that are, so that you don't get carried away in thinking that it's millimeter accurate on something, when actually all of that accuracy is based on a scaling dimension that is, it's there or thereabouts, but it's not that accurate.
And this is our last slide from your set here.
Yeah, so this is then the sort of final 2 stages of the model, which are essentially just computation hungry at this point. So on the left is the wireframed meshed model that's generated a 3D solid model. And then on the right is the textured image, which is then laid over that. You've mentioned about decimation. This model, when it generated the model, there are 140 million triangles in it. In order to show that on a web-based platform, we then decimated that down to 2 million triangles, which is a huge step in quality. But at the same time, the model at 140 million triangles is almost totally unusable. I don't think there is software that will show the model and enable you to use it and pan around it in a way that is actually functional at that size.
That latency is a real problem. And so the one that you posted, the links are here so that people can have a quick look at this on Sketchfab, which is where you were sharing it with the team, and where we want to make quick interrogations of the model.
And this is a very good platform for sharing 3D models in a very intuitive and non-technical way. It has some very basic model interpretation things, but mostly it enables people to look around the model and see it. And we find for discussion with contractors, for discussion with clients, this is an amazing platform where you can take people who haven't been able to go to site for whatever reason and say, oh, we want you to look at this bit of the chimney. How do you think we might lift these stones down? How do you think we might get that to a level base to rebuild off? And that side of it is incredibly powerful.
And I can see on there the big fuzzy blobs of trees now. That
it doesn't like vegetation capturing reality as a process, because everything in vegetation moves. And because it's in a different place in every image, it really, really dislikes it.
Okay, I'm going to run a quick poll now. So based on the conversation we've had today, I wonder what people think is the best use case for digital models? Is it, potential for savings? Is it just more efficient? Or would you say you feel, as I say, you've just got one choice here, it's a vote. Is it because you're going to cut down on your carbon footprint? Is it because of improved safety? Are you looking for technical accuracy? Or is it the communication benefit that you think is going to be the main outcome for you? Let's see if everybody here can vote. We've got 25 voters. Okay. So we did get one person voted for safety, but I think the majority of people, by quite a measure, were thinking that it's about better communication about the heritage asset. Now, have we got time for a bit of a discussion? Are there any questions in the chat? Anybody would like to talk to Tom about the case study? No, you've stunned them, Tom.
That's very surprising.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.